Wild predators can strike when you least expect it, turning ordinary days into life-or-death struggles in the blink of an eye. From a grizzly bear rampaging through an RV park in Washington, leaving families trapped and injured in the pre-dawn chaos, to a massive polar bear lunging at a zookeeper in northern Norway. These encounters reveal the raw power and unpredictability of nature. In this video, we'll take you through 6 chilling true stories of bear attacks on humans, each one a gripping tale of survival, danger, and the fragile line between man and wild. On September 5, 2025, in the quiet hours before dawn, the stillness of the Selkirk Mountains was broken by the heavy scrape of claws against metal and the muffled crash of containers tumbling to the ground, sounds that at first seemed distant, but quickly grew sharper and closer as a grizzly bear prowled through the edge of a remote RV park tucked into the northern Washington wilderness. It was drawn by the pungent smell of overflowing trash barrels left unsecured through the night, a mistake that would prove costly as the predator's hunger pushed it into the very heart of human presence. Families who had settled into the park for the weekend, believing themselves sheltered by the walls of their vehicles and the order of their campsite, stirred uneasily as the noises deepened into sharp cracks of plastic coolers splitting apart and the dull thud of tables being overturned. In that fragile moment between sleep and full awareness, the realization began to dawn that something powerful was tearing through their camp with little fear and boundless strength, leaving behind splinters of wood, scattered food, and trails of trash. It was a dog's frantic barking that escalated the chaos into panic. The piercing sound carried across the rows of parked vehicles and snapped the grizzly's attention from the scattered scraps to the movement of life within the camp. In an instant, the animal shifted from scavenger to aggressor, lowering its head and charging toward the noise with explosive speed. Claws dug into the ground as it closed the distance and slammed against the side of a nearby RV with enough force to rock the vehicle on its wheels. Inside, startled families pressed against windows and walls, holding their breath as the animal's massive frame loomed outside. One unit, however, had been left vulnerable, a door half open to catch the mountain air in the cool pre-dawn hours. That single mistake gave the bear an opening as it lunged forward, pushing through with violent strength, splintering the latch and forcing its way into the cramped interior where a 42-year-old woman had been rising from her bed. She reacted too late before the grizzly's massive paw came down, claws slashing across her shoulder and arm. The weight of the blow sent her crashing against the narrow counter as blood surged from deep gashes that burned with sudden, unbearable pain. Her screams filled the campground, piercing through the din of smashing metal and snarling breath. In the confusion outside, neighbors stumbled from their vehicles, desperation overtaking fear as they banged pots and slammed metal lids together. Their improvised clamor echoed across the park, while others leaned on their horns, the blaring sound bouncing off the surrounding trees. It became a cacophony of defiance meant to drive back the animal that had brought terror into what had once felt like a safe retreat. The bear, startled by the intensity of the noise and the sudden rising wall of human resistance, wheeled around and retreated from the RV. It left behind streaks of blood and broken wood as it dropped back into the open campground, pacing with restless energy. It prowled between vehicles and smashed at whatever caught its attention, ripping open a grill with the strength of its jaws and clawing at thin doors as families cowered within. Hearts pounded with the knowledge that the barriers between them and the predator were fragile and might fail if the animal decided to press harder. For long minutes, the grizzly stalked the park, its low growls carried by the mountain air as children cried quietly from behind curtains and adults stood helpless at the windows. Trembling hands clutched at nothing more useful than flashlights or cooking knives, knowing such items would be useless if the bear forced its way inside. It seemed as though the night would never end, as though the predator might continue its rampage until nothing was left unbroken. Then came the sharp crack of warning shots, the heavy sound of gunfire echoing from the tree line as rangers, roused by urgent calls and racing from a nearby station, lifted rifles and fired into the air. The sudden violence of the sound cut through the chaos, startling the grizzly as it reared up before turning and crashing through brush, snapping branches as it bounded back toward the dark forest. Its massive form disappeared into the shadows that had birthed it. Silence fell in fragments, broken only by the sobs of frightened children and the strained voices of adults trying to steady themselves. When the danger seemed finally to have passed, attention turned inward, toward the wounded woman who sat trembling. Her arm and shoulder had been torn open, her skin shredded by claws that had come within inches of ending her life. Though she bled heavily and her face was pale with shock, she remained alive, clinging to consciousness as neighbors bound her wounds with makeshift bandages until emergency crews could arrive. Others had not escaped unharmed, though their injuries were lesser. Bruises and scrapes earned in frantic flights from one vehicle to another, knees bloodied as they stumbled in the dark, or backs sore from slamming into hard surfaces while trying to flee the charging animal. All of them knew they had been close to tragedy, that the night could have ended with far greater loss if the bear had not been driven off when it was. By mid-morning, the park was a landscape of destruction. Tables lay shattered, coolers split, grills crushed into twisted shapes, and trash was scattered across the clearing in a grim reminder of what had drawn the predator there in the first place. The lingering smell of food and waste remained heavy in the air. As officials surveyed the scene, they spoke carefully, noting that the grizzly likely wandered across the border from Idaho, part of a population that ranged widely through the Selkirk Mountains. Such a population was powerful enough to remind anyone who crossed its path that no boundary set by humans could keep these creatures away if hunger pressed them forward. The woman was flown to a nearby hospital where surgeons cleaned and closed the deep lacerations. Her survival was ensured, though her recovery would be long and marked by scars that would never fade. For the rest of the families who had cowered through the attack, the memory remained etched into their minds, a permanent warning of how fragile safety could be when wild predators moved freely in the same landscapes where humans built their camps and trusted too much in thin walls and careless choices. On August 18, 2024, the air over northern British Columbia was cool and heavy with the damp scent of moss and river water, the wide channel flowing steady and calm between banks lined with spruce and alder. Silence seemed unbroken, except for the rush of current and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. Into this quiet wilderness, Lily Thompson, 28 years old, and Sam Reed, 34, pushed their canoe forward, their paddles slicing through the water with an easy rhythm that carried them deeper into the untamed backcountry. They had planned the trip as an escape from their demanding lives, a chance to move slowly through wild country where cell signals vanished, and only the sounds of wind, water, and wildlife filled the air. They carried little more than provisions, a tent, and the simple gear needed to navigate the river, their focus fixed on the experience rather than the destination, unaware that their path would soon intersect with one of the most dangerous predators in North America. Midway through the morning, the canoe drifted into a broad bend where the river slowed slightly, its surface dappled with sunlight slipping between high branches. In the shallows near the center, movement caught Sam's eye. A massive brown bear standing tall in the water, its front legs braced against the current as it swung powerful paws into the stream, scooping salmon from the rush and tossing them onto slick stones where the flashes of silver writhed only briefly before becoming prey. Lily's breath caught as she gripped the edge of the canoe, her eyes fixed on the immense figure whose shoulders rose higher than a man's chest. The thick coat glistened with water, and muscle rolled beneath the fur with every motion, a sight both majestic and terrifying. As the canoe glided closer, the bear finally noticed them, its head turning, small dark eyes narrowing as its jaws parted to release a low growl that carried across the water like a warning pulled from the deep. The predator shifted, abandoning its scattered fish, and slapped at the water with one paw, sending droplets high into the air. The display of dominance sent ripples through the current and raised every hair on the paddlers' necks. In that instant, the weight of their vulnerability pressed hard upon them. Their thin canoe was nothing more than a fragile shell on the wide river, powerless against the force of an animal that could overturn it with a single blow. Sam's instincts surged. He lifted his paddle and slammed it against the aluminum hull with a sharp, echoing clang that rang out above the flow. Then he splashed water violently toward the bear, hoping the sudden commotion might break its advance. Lily, gripping her jacket, raised it high above her head and waved it in sharp arcs, her body tense as she tried to appear larger, stronger, less like prey. For a moment that stretched long and unbearable, the bear's decision balanced on the edge of silence. Muscles coiled as it shifted forward, the heavy growl rising again from its chest as it lunged a short distance through the water, crashing closer with startling speed. The wake from its charge lifted the canoe and rocked it side to side until both paddlers gripped desperately to keep their balance. Gear rattled loose and slipped overboard as a small pack and water jug tumbled into the river. The massive paw rose and swept across the surface, striking the floating objects with enough force to send them spinning downstream. Though the distance between the canoe and the bear had closed dangerously, the combined noise, splashing and erratic motion of the humans seemed to sow hesitation in the animal's mind. Its aggression faltered as it huffed and swung its head, assessing whether the strange intruders were truly worth the risk. Finally, with a sharp exhale, the bear backed toward the shallows. It stepped heavily until reaching the riverbank, then shook water from its coat in a violent spray before lowering its muzzle once again toward the salmon scattered on the rocks. It chose the certainty of its feast over the uncertainty of the canoe, though its lingering presence kept the paddlers frozen, their bodies rigid as they clutched their paddles, unwilling to move too soon and draw the predator's attention back upon them. Only after several long minutes did Sam ease the paddle into the water, his movements measured and slow as Lily mirrored him. Together they steered the canoe with careful strokes, pushing steadily downriver until the bear became nothing more than a dark shape retreating into the greenery. Its size diminished with distance, but the memory of its power was etched deep into their minds, a reminder that even in the tranquility of open water, the wild could erupt in a surge of danger without warning. When the bend of the river finally placed distance between them and the encounter, tension broke into exhaustion. Their arms trembled as they laid the paddles across their laps and drifted for a moment, soaked through from frantic splashing, their provisions lighter with several items lost to the current. Their greatest relief lay in the fact that their bodies remained unmarked, spared from claws and teeth that could have ended everything in seconds. As the sun rose higher and the sounds of the forest returned, birdsong weaving through branches and the steady gurgle of water filling the silence, they carried on with renewed caution. Their senses sharpened, alert to every movement along the banks, aware now that in salmon season rivers drew not just fish and birds, but also predators whose size and strength transformed peaceful crossings into battles of nerve and instinct. For Lily and Sam, the encounter became a lesson written not in books or signs, but in the pounding of their hearts and the raw fear coursing through their veins. It was a lesson that survival in the wilderness required both respect for the animals that claimed it as their own, and the quick decisions that could turn moments of deadly risk into narrow escapes. On November 3, 2002, the air in British Columbia's Fraser Valley carried the sharp bite of early winter. High ridges were dusted in snow while the lower canyon remained damp with the smell of sawdust and fuel. A 6-man logging crew worked steadily under the supervision of their foreman, Jack Turner, a 45-year-old veteran of the trade whose weathered hands and steady voice kept order among the men as chainsaws growled and trees thundered down into the valley floor. The rhythm of industry echoed against the walls of granite and fir. The men were familiar with bears, for sightings were part of life in that remote country where wilderness pressed against every road and trail. When a thin and restless grizzly began circling the worksite in the days before the attack, they treated it lightly, laughing at the way its ribs showed beneath its fur, and joking that it looked more like a stray dog than a threat. Their confidence was born from years of encounters that ended without incident, never realizing that the animal's desperation was growing with every hour it lingered. By midday, the sounds of saws filled the clearing, echoing against the canyon walls as Miguel Alvarez, a 32-year-old father of 2, worked at the base of a spruce, his chainsaw biting into the trunk while the others hauled branches and stacked timber. Their attention was fixed on labor until the sudden crash of brush behind them shattered the rhythm, a violent disruption that carried with it the deep roar of a bear charging with terrifying speed. The grizzly burst through the undergrowth, gaunt yet powerful, its fur matted and its jaws open in a furious bellow as it barreled across the worksite. Equipment scattered as men dove for cover, saws clattered to the ground and fuel cans toppled. The entire scene erupted into chaos before anyone had time to react with more than instinct. Miguel turned just as the predator reached him. A massive swipe wrenched the chainsaw from his hands, the teeth still spinning as it skidded across the dirt. In the next instant, the bear's claws raked across his body, dragging him to the ground with crushing force. The attack was so sudden and violent that his cries were drowned by the snarls filling the clearing, a brutal clash of flesh and power that froze the others in horror. The men scattered in panic. Some scrambled toward the trucks parked at the edge of the site, slamming doors and fumbling with locks as though thin glass and steel could shield them. 2 others, cut off from escape, clambered up trees, their boots slipping against bark as they pulled themselves higher, branches bending beneath their weight while the predator tore into the ground below, its fury fixed on anything that moved. One worker stumbled in his retreat and felt the bear's weight crash into him, claws slicing across his leg. He screamed and kicked in desperation, rolling free only as the animal shifted its assault toward another man who had tripped near the saws. The predator struck again with slashing blows that left him bleeding heavily. His face twisted with agony as his companions watched helplessly from their perches or the sealed trucks where they sat gripping the wheels, praying the thin barriers would hold. The radios they carried crackled uselessly in the remote canyon, their signals swallowed by stone and distance. The survivors were stranded with no hope of immediate rescue. When at last the bear retreated into the brush, leaving behind blood and silence, they gathered the wounded as best they could, dragging them into a crude camp where blankets and tarps were spread across the ground. Trembling hands bound wounds with belts and torn shirts. Knowing it was not enough, but having nothing better to give, night fell heavy over the valley. Darkness thickened and cold seeped into bone. In that silence came the haunting certainty that the ordeal was not finished. Twice before dawn, the Grizzly returned, its shape looming just beyond the edge of firelight, eyes glowing faintly in the dark as it circled the camp, puffing and growling. Its presence was undeniable as the injured bit down against cries of pain, forced into silence by the knowledge that even a groan might draw the predator back into their midst. Every snapping branch jolted the survivors awake. Their bodies were taut with fear, each minute dragging into eternity as they waited for the brush to part again. Their nerves stretched to breaking while the injured drifted in and out of consciousness, faces pale in the dim glow of flashlights, as the cold pressed harder, gnawing at strength already drained by blood loss and terror. By morning, the ordeal had stripped them raw. Eyes were sunken and limbs shook with exhaustion. The clearing lay littered with abandoned tools and broken ground where the attack had first erupted. Only then, as the dull thrum of helicopter blades grew from a distant hum to a roar above the trees, did hope return. Rescue crews lowered through the thin opening of the canyon, their arrival delayed by the remoteness and the failed radios that had sealed the crew in isolation through the longest night of their lives. The injured were lifted into stretchers and carried skyward, their blood staining the canvas as medics worked frantically to stabilize them. The others stood silently among the wreckage of their worksite, faces hollowed by exhaustion and grief, as Miguel's body was taken with them. The cost of misplaced confidence laid bare in the most brutal way. In the aftermath, officials spoke of the pressures that had driven the Grizzly into such persistence, the loss of habitat in shrinking forests, the scarcity of food that left it thin and desperate, and the forces that had combined to create a predator willing to test its limits against humans. Jack Turner and the remaining crew would never forget that day. On July 18, 2021, the coastal air of a remote Alaskan island carried the mingled scents of salt, spruce, and damp earth, a landscape steeped in natural beauty and deep human history. It was here that American archaeologist Dr. Lena Harris, 42 years old, and her assistant Mark Sullivan, 30, established their excavation, carefully peeling back layers of soil from ancient midden sites that held fragments of lives long gone. Pieces of shell and bone resting silent beneath moss for centuries emerged once again under the brushes that traced their shapes back into the daylight. The day began in calm rhythm. The pair crouched on tarps stretched across uneven ground, tools laid neatly in rows as they brushed, sifted, and cataloged. Their attention stayed on the fragile task before them while packed lunches waited at the edge of the site, untouched until midday. Behind them, the forest rose in dense green walls. From beyond came the cries of gulls and the muffled crash of surf against a rocky shoreline, a steady reminder of the isolation that defined their work. Both researchers knew that giant coastal brown bears roamed the island's woods, the largest of their kind in the world, immense predators weighing over 1,000 pounds, capable of moving with startling speed. Yet months of preparation and carefully reviewed safety protocols gave them confidence. Vigilance, they believed, would be enough. Their focus remained on the past, not the dangers pressing at the edges of the present. But as the sun climbed and heat lifted scents into the air, the oversight of leaving food nearby drew the attention of something far greater than the tools scattered across the ground. The warning came suddenly in the violent crash of branches from the tree line, alder limbs snapping as a massive bear burst into view. Its shoulders rolled beneath a thick coat, while its head swung to fix small, dark eyes on the camp. In an instant, the fragile stillness of the excavation dissolved into chaos. Mark froze where he crouched, his trowel slipping from his hands into the dirt as the predator surged forward with earth-shaking force. The animal closed the distance in seconds, its roar echoing through the clearing as it barreled across the ground. A swipe of its claws shredded the corner of a tarp, scattering delicate tools across the soil and obliterating their careful arrangement. Lena felt panic rise hard in her chest, as she scrambled to her feet, reaching for the only object within arm's reach, a long wooden brush handle. She raised it high before slamming it against the ground again and again, each hollow thud carrying both fear and defiance. Mark, jolted into motion by the nearness of the beast, tore off his jacket and swung it above his head. His voice rose in desperate shouts, cracking the air with a fragile wall of noise meant to deter the predator. His legs trembled beneath him as the weight of their reality sank in. One wrong step, one shift in the animal's intent, and survival could dissolve in an instant. The bear reared slightly, jaws gaping wide in a roar that split the air. It stepped into their supplies, nosing through packs and containers with heavy swipes that sent papers, fragments, and artifacts tumbling across the dirt. Objects untouched for centuries were scattered and broken in moments, history reduced to debris beneath claws that cared nothing for preservation. What drew the predator's attention was not the fragile remnants of ancient lives, but the scent of food seeping from the bags stacked against the soil. Every second dragged with unbearable weight as the massive form loomed only feet away. Its muzzle dipped to sniff the ground before it pawed violently at the supplies, ripping fabric and scattering contents. The sound of tearing canvas mixed with the dull clatter of boxes toppling. Lena and Mark kept their frantic display alive, arms swinging, voices raw, movements wild in the face of a predator that seemed to test their will. At times it pressed closer, then pulled back, its strength dominating the small clearing as though it alone decided whether they would live. Finally, with a deep huff and sharp shake of its head, the bear turned. It crashed back into the trees with the same suddenness with which it had appeared. Branches bowed and snapped under its weight until the dark form slipped again into shadow. Silence pressed heavy in its wake, broken only by the ragged sound of human breath. Adrenaline coursed through their bodies as the realization of survival struck with force equal to the terror of the moment before. The dig site lay in ruin. Carps hung in tatters. Artifacts were scattered across trampled soil. Fragile items chipped and broken beneath paws that had cut without hesitation. Both Lena and Mark remained physically intact, their bodies marked only by scrapes from their frantic scramble and bruises from their falls. Yet they knew how close they had come to devastation, how easily the encounter could have shifted from chaos to tragedy had the predator pressed its attack instead of retreating. They moved carefully through the wreckage, gathering what tools and fragments they could salvage, hands trembling as they worked. Every sound from the forest pulled their attention, every rustle of leaves twisting nerves tighter, every creak of branches convincing them the animal might return at any moment. Though no further assault came, the memory of its power clung to the clearing like a shadow no amount of sunlight could dispel. By evening, the camp bore deep scars of the encounter. Supplies were thinned, tools bent or broken, progress halted not by the challenges of excavation, but by the undeniable truth that even the best-prepared expedition could collapse in seconds beneath the weight of nature's fury. As the two sat in silence, eyes fixed on the tree line that had betrayed them, the lesson pressed heavily on their thoughts. In this wilderness, the past was never separate from the present, and the land gave no allowances for distraction. For Lena and Mark, the event stood as a stark reminder. Survival in such places demanded not only knowledge and preparation, but also respect for forces beyond human control. Those forces could erupt without warning, turning centuries-old soil into the stage for a struggle where noise, defiance, and fortune alone might decide whether human lives continued or ended as another layer of history beneath the moss. For the children and staff of a small rural elementary school in a northeastern state, the final week of May was always a time of celebration and relief, a chance to close the books, step away from lessons, and welcome the long days of summer. On May 28, 2022, the tradition of gathering outside on the wide school lawn for a year-end picnic carried the same sense of familiarity and joy it always had. Parents came to help, teachers organized games, and the scent of grilled burgers, hot dogs, and baked goods drifted across the yard in the warmth of late spring. The building stood behind them as a reassuring backdrop. Its doors opened to classrooms filled with decorations and half-finished projects, while the surrounding woods loomed quietly at the edge of the property. The morning passed in laughter and excitement, with children chasing one another across the grass while staff kept careful watch. Tables had been arranged in neat rows, draped with bright cloths and covered in food that reflected both effort and abundance. Yet beneath the calm routine of this yearly ritual, unseen movements were already underway beyond the tree line. In the dense woods bordering the playground, a large black bear foraged, its hunger sharpened by the season. its nose lifted to the breeze. The smell of cooking meat and sweets carried easily through the still air, and the animal, driven by instinct stronger than caution, began following the scent toward the clearing. The first sign of danger came as a faint shift in the edge of the trees. A shadow moved where none should have, followed by the unmistakable form of the bear stepping into view, broad and heavy, its dark fur glinting in the sun. At first, a few adults thought it might simply pass along the tree line, uninterested in the gathering, but the steady pace of its approach soon erased that hope. The bear advanced with deliberate focus, nose twitching, eyes fixed on the crowded tables, heedless of the rising shrieks as children noticed it. Panic spread in an instant. Some children bolted for the doors, sneakers pounding across the pavement as teachers called for order. Others froze, small faces twisted in confusion and fear as the enormity of the animal sank in. The bear was not wandering idly. It was closing the distance step by step, its size dwarfing anything the children had seen outside of books or screens. Among the staff, Sarah Whitman, a 34-year-old teacher, reacted with instinct and resolve. Known for her calm presence in the classroom and her dedication to her students, she had been supervising the food tables when the bear appeared. In that moment of chaos, she took it upon herself to protect those who were slowest to react, gathering them with urgent gestures and steering them toward the entrance. But as she did so, the bear's pace quickened. Hunger emboldened it, and it veered toward the nearest picnic table, scattering paper plates and plastic cups as it climbed onto the benches. The sound of splintering wood and crashing dishes deepened the panic. Sarah, realizing that the animal's proximity to the children left no time to retreat herself, seized a folding chair and raised it, stepping between the bear and the last cluster of students. The animal swiped with sudden power, striking her arm and leg, and sent her sprawling onto the grass. Pain tore through her body as claws left deep lacerations, and children's screams rose higher as they witnessed their teacher fall. For a moment, the outcome seemed inevitable. The bear's bulk loomed over the tables, its head swinging back toward the food, its growl vibrating across the yard. Yet other staff members acted with desperate creativity. Several grabbed nearby metal trash cans, upending them and smashing them together, the sharp metallic clang cutting through the clearing. Others stamped and shouted, creating as much noise as possible. The coordinated uproar startled the animal, forcing it to pause, its attention divided between the easy meal before it and the confusing barrage of sound. Minutes stretched like hours. The bear circled the wreckage, sniffing through scattered food, pawing at wrappers and packages, yet each attempt to settle was interrupted by relentless banging and shouting. The children, now mostly inside the building, pressed their faces to classroom windows, wide-eyed as they watched the confrontation unfold. Teachers inside worked to steady them, though the noise outside made it impossible to shield them fully from the reality of what was happening. At last, with a final huff and sharp snort, the bear turned back toward the trees, lumbering into the shadows as suddenly as it had appeared. The clamor faded, leaving behind silence broken only by sobs and the rustle of trampled grass. The yard bore the marks of the struggle. Tables overturned, food scattered in every direction, plastic cups crushed underfoot. On the ground near the center of it all lay Sarah, her clothes torn and blood pooling beneath her wounds. Colleagues rushed to her side, improvising bandages with jackets and napkins, their voices urgent as they worked to keep her conscious. Emergency responders were called, and though the minutes felt unbearably long, they eventually arrived, stabilizing Sarah and transporting her to the nearest hospital. Her injuries were severe, with deep wounds to her leg and arm, but she survived. Her intervention had bought precious time for the children to reach safety. Relief flooded the parents who embraced their children afterward, tempered by the knowledge of how close they had come to catastrophe. In the days that followed, wildlife experts explained that the incident, while frightening, was not inexplicable. Black bears in spring are opportunistic, often emerging from lean winters with desperate drives to find food. The animal's actions, though terrifying, were born of instinct rather than malice, yet the consequences had been nearly tragic. What began as a day of celebration ended as a solemn reminder of the fragile balance between human gatherings and the untamed world pressing at their edges. Yet within the chaos, courage and quick thinking had prevented disaster from becoming far worse. On March 14, 2024, the remote air of northern Norway carried a bitter chill that crept beneath heavy coats, stiffened fingers, and frosted the edges of the polar bear enclosure at a small, isolated zoo where Martin Hayes, 38 years old, began his morning routine. The facility, tucked into the high Arctic landscape far from urban centers, specialized in Arctic species and demanded strict attention to animal care and safety protocols. Martin had spent years navigating the unpredictable temperaments of apex predators, and his knowledge of behavior, body language, and timing had earned him the reputation of a careful and capable professional, one who respected the immense power of the animals he worked with daily. That morning, the sun had barely risen over snow-dusted hills, casting pale streaks of light across the frozen tundra. Martin moved through his tasks methodically, carrying fish in insulated containers, checking water levels in the pools, and inspecting the integrity of barriers, gates, and feeding stations. The polar bear enclosure was expansive, designed to replicate natural terrain as closely as possible, with ice ridges, rock outcrops, and a deep pool where the bears could swim freely. Yet no matter the precautions, the sheer size and strength of a polar bear, capable of toppling heavy gates and displacing concrete, meant that every interaction carried inherent risk. The bear he was tending to that day, a massive male named Njord, had already been showing signs of agitation. Low growls rumbled in his chest, and his movements were restless, paws scraping at the frozen ground, eyes fixed on Martin as he approached with the morning fish. Though Njord had been fed only hours earlier, the presence of a human so close to his territory was enough to heighten tension, a reminder that even routine activities could spiral into danger within seconds. Martin moved toward the feeding area, careful to stay behind the safety barrier and follow established procedures. He adjusted the delivery trays, monitoring Njord's reactions while ensuring that water levels were adequate and surfaces free of debris. Then, in a moment that seemed sudden and surreal, Njord lunged forward. Curiosity and frustration fueled the bear's movement. Martin instinctively stepped back, but the safety barrier, a final line of defense, failed to perform as intended. A section of the gate, weakened by a malfunction, allowed the bear to reach through with its massive forelimb. The strike was devastating in both force and speed. Njord's paw connected with Martin's right arm and chest, throwing him off balance and onto the icy ground. Pain surged through his body in bruises and sharp lacerations, and adrenaline clouded his ability to assess the extent of his injuries. The bear pressed against the gate with enough power that Martin could feel the heat of its body and the weight of its strength, each moment a reminder of how quickly control could vanish in the presence of an apex predator. Behind him, fellow staff recognized the immediate danger and acted without hesitation. Emergency alarms were triggered, their shrill wail echoing through the facility. Several staff members grabbed metal feeding buckets and banged them against railings, creating a harsh clamor designed to disorient and startle the bear. Njord paused, his attention divided, ears flicking and eyes scanning as the sudden noise disrupted his focus. After tense seconds, he hesitated, then withdrew from the faulty barrier, retreating toward the deeper sections of the pool. That space, however temporary, allowed Martin to breathe and cling to consciousness. Even after Njord's retreat, the impact of the encounter left Martin shaken and in severe pain. Colleagues rushed to his side, applying pressure to his wounds, immobilizing his arm, and preparing him for medical evacuation. Given the facility's remote location, an airlift was required, and the process was tense and methodical, with every second weighed against the risk of shock or worsening injuries. At the hospital, Martin underwent extensive treatment for lacerations and deep bruising. Despite the severity of his wounds, he survived, a testament to both his resilience and the immediate intervention of his colleagues. In the aftermath, the incident was closely examined by officials and wildlife experts. While the bear had acted within the bounds of natural instinct, curiosity, territorial behavior, and reaction to human presence, the failure of a single gate highlighted the razor-thin line between safety and disaster. Even in controlled environments, the event underscored the necessity of strict protocols, redundancies in barrier design, and rigorous emergency preparedness. For Martin Hayes, the experience left lasting marks, both physical and psychological. The memory of the bear lunging, the impact against his body, and the surreal seconds in which his control vanished were indelible reminders of the risks of his profession. For the rest of the staff, the incident reinforced the constant vigilance required when working with large predators, driving renewed commitment to reviewing every procedure and closing any gaps that might allow a similar event to occur. Njord, for his part, returned to his enclosure with no visible change in behavior, unaware of the consequences of his actions. The zoo's management immediately implemented upgrades to barriers, introduced more frequent safety audits, and provided additional training to ensure that no incident of this kind could happen again. The story of the attack spread beyond the facility, serving as a stark reminder that even in a controlled setting, the line between human management and wild instinct is fragile. Visitors who later came to the zoo were reminded of the immense power of polar bears, whose size, strength, and unpredictability make them one of the most formidable land carnivores in existence. For zookeepers and wildlife professionals, the event underscored a reality they already knew well, that years of experience, careful planning, and strict procedures can reduce risk, but never fully eliminate it. One malfunction, one brief failure in infrastructure, was all it took to transform a routine morning into a life-threatening encounter. The memory of that morning in northern Norway would remain long after Martin's bruises healed, a lesson in the balance between human authority and the uncompromising forces of nature.